Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Marlene Bellman, and I'm a staff officer with the Pacific Fishery Management Council. Thank you for coming and participating in this process and attending this stock assessment outreach session for the groundfish work that was conducted during the stock assessment cycle for 2025. Please, we have handouts available over here in the room. I also want to say thank you to all the folks that are participating remotely. For in-person folks, we will be following a flow of the meeting, and when it is time for question and answer or to engage with the assessment, I ask you to please come up to one of these tables here and push the button to see the green light so that you can speak into the microphone. This is important so that the folks online that are participating remotely can also hear your questions and have that dialogue. So in-person folks, please come up to one of the tables and unmute the microphone. Remember to mute it when you leave the table. For folks online, hopefully you can see the slide. We're going to ask you to follow the typical RingCentral format where we ask you to raise your hand, and then we will facilitate and call on each person that has a hand raised, hopefully in the order of raised hands, and do it that way, and then you will be unmuted so that you can speak. All right. With that, I think I will turn it over to the Northwest Fishery Science Center to get you started on this session.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and thanks for attending. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeremy Russin. I'm the acting science director at the Northwest Fishery Science Center, and welcome to our groundfish stock assessment outreach session. We're really appreciative of your interest, and we're excited about this event. Improving how we communicate scientific results is one of the priorities for our agency and for Northwest Fishery Science Center. I appreciate that our staff are constantly thinking about how they can do all of their work better and more efficiently. And this doesn't stop at simply data collection and analysis. It extends all the way through how we deliver scientific information and making sure that it gets to those who rely on it, whether that be for fisheries management or for business decisions or any number of uses. So that's something that we take really seriously and spend a lot of time on. We can do great science at the Science Center, but if we don't make the information available to those who need it, and so it can have the desired impact, then we've really failed to meet an important part of our mission. So we hope you find these overviews helpful and informative, and we encourage you to use this time to ask questions and dig into issues that you have particular interest in these discussions and make the most of this opportunity. So thank you for attending, and I'll turn it over to Kristen.
Thanks, Jeremy. And thank you all for being here. My name is Kristen Marshall. I'm from the Northwest Fishery Science Center, and I am the Population Ecology Program Manager there. And the Population Ecology Program consists of all of our groundfish stock assessment scientists as well as our aging lab. So I want to welcome you to our session today. And again, thanks for taking time out of your Saturday afternoon when you could be watching football or taking a nap or doing something else. So I really appreciate the commitment to communication and understanding around the assessments that we're going to be sharing with you today. And that extends also to our participants online, who we really wish that we could all be together in one room, but we really appreciate that you're here, and we'll look forward to questions from you later on. I just want to take a minute to talk about a couple of the different communication efforts that we have underway at the Science Center with respect to stock assessments this cycle. And so in addition to this info session that we're doing right now, we've got sort of three other things I want to highlight. One is the at-a-glance summaries that are the printed handouts that were over there by the door. And if you're online, you can find those in the briefing book as a Science Center report under agenda item G3, Adopt Stock Assessments. So these are meant to be high-level overviews of our assessment results and answer some questions about they're meant to try to answer some questions about why this year's assessments might be a little bit different from previous assessments, where those differences are coming from, what's driving them, and how we understand them. So you'll see in the presentations today that a lot of the material will be similar between these high-level printed out summaries that you have and the slides, and that's intentional. So that's one thing that we're doing. A second thing I'll mention is the groundfish risk tables that we are piloting in our many of our benchmark assessments this cycle. Those are on the second page of these at-a-glance summaries. And well, we won't be talking about those a lot at this meeting, and you won't see them in this presentation. I think this is an important area where we're experimenting with how to communicate uncertainty around stock assessments and do that across a variety of domains. And so we look for feedback on that when the council comes back to the discussion of risk tables at either the November or March meeting, depending on when it gets scheduled. And then lastly, I just want to mention an ongoing opportunity separate from the one specific to this assessment cycle, and that is the data and stock assessment monthly call that Jason Cope hosts on the second Friday of every month at 10 o'clock. And those are open meetings for anybody to come attend. And if you want to ask questions about data or stock assessments, there's a lot of really good conversations that have been happening over more than 2 years, 3 years he's been doing them. And so if you haven't heard about those, you want to get on the email list, talk to me, talk to Jason here. We'd be glad to add you, and excited for the iterative opportunities to communicate about this work. And then with that, I just want to reiterate that with all of these efforts that we're working towards, this is really a relationship and it's iterative. And so we need feedback from you all on what's landing and what's not landing. What do you need more of? What do you need less of? And how can we improve this moving forward? And so in this meeting, we'll have open discussion at the end. You can feel free to use that opportunity or catch any of us in the hallways. We're here to be receptive to what you need and want to adapt that moving forward. Okay, and then I think with that, I'm going to move to our session overview and just give you all a sense of what to expect for today. So we are going to go through 7 different stock assessments, the 5 benchmarks, and the 2 updates. So for each one of these, we'll have one of the lead assessors come up here and sit at the table, and they will run through about a 5-minute overview presentation of the assessment, and then we'll open it up for questions after each one. And so if you're in the room and you want to come ask a question, please come sit at the table, as Marlene said. And if you're online and you want to ask a question, raise your hand and we'll bring you into the conversation that way. And then if after about 15 minutes after each one, if there's still ongoing questions, we'll ask you to hold them and come back to them at the end. At the end, we'll have an open discussion for anything that we didn't get to or anything that's left over. And I think with that, we are ready to jump into our first presentation with Yellowtail. So thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Marlene. And if you want to put up the next slide for us. So I'm going to welcome Kiva Oken to the table, and she is going to speak to the Yellowtail Rockfish Benchmark Assessment.
Thanks, Kristen. As Kristen said, my name is Kiva Oken, and I led the Yellowtail Rockfish Stock Assessment. So this assessment is for the northern stock of Yellowtail Rockfish, which is north of around Cape Mendocino and is the much larger of the 2 that we manage at the Pacific Council. After a lot of intensive review and discussion at the STAR panel, in particular in response to a lot of public comment on the first day of the STAR panel, we ultimately ended up making no changes to the proposed model. So if you go to the next slide, I'll start with some key outputs of the assessment. So we estimate that the fraction of unfished spawning output in 2025 is around 62%, which is well above our target of 40%. So the stock is quite healthy. In terms of population size, we estimate that the biomass of fish age 4 and older, that's around when the recreational fisheries start seeing them, is close to 93,000 metric tons. And this is compared to what we think would be the size of the population would be without fishing, which is around 93,000 metric tons. Or sorry, 134,000 metric tons. And recent catches have been averaging around 3,000 to 4,000 metric tons. I do want to point out those recent catches are quite a bit higher than they were prior to 2017, which is when the last assessment occurred. And this is due to growth of the midwater trawl fishery. The OFLs from this model are a bit lower than they were in the 2017 model. So compared to 2024, the 2027 OFL is 13% lower. However, after a catch-only update 2 years ago, the OFLs went up. So compared to 2025, it's around 26% lower. Next slide. So you're probably all wondering why the OFLs are going down. And the number one reason is the way that the commercial age data were processed. So this is a bit technical, but the SSC recommends weighting each commercial age sample relative to the amount of catch it represents. So this means that age samples from a trip or a state that collected a lot of samples but had relatively little catch are going to be weighted less than age samples from a trip or a state that collected very few samples but had a lot of catch. We're not really sure why this was not done in 2017. Those records are no longer available. But ultimately, it led to relatively more older fish and fewer younger fish in the age frequencies, which updated the model's estimates of natural mortality and stock size. And when we talk about stock size, I want to emphasize that for two equally healthy populations, they have the same fraction unfished, the same stock size, the same fraction of fish, the same stock status, we can sustainably take out a lot more fish from a larger population. So if we estimate a smaller stock size, even an equally healthy population is going to support less fishing. So the figure on the right shows how the population size in the 2017 assessment model, which is in blue, changes when all we do is update the commercial age data. So the red line shows what happens when we use the set of age samples that we used this time around. The filtering practices for 2017 were again not retained. And this leads to a pretty small 2% drop in the 2019 OFL. However, the green line is where all the action is, and that's what happens when we apply this correct weighting procedure that the SSC recommends. And when that happens, the OFL declines by an additional 16%. So that's the biggest factor that changed. Next slide. I'd say the second most influential factor, which was a big topic of discussion during the STAR panel, is the bottom trawl survey index, and in particular, just adding 8 more years of data. So now we're starting with a 2025 base model in blue. And if we cut off the data in just the trawl survey index in 2016, leave everything the same. 2016 is where it was cut off in the previous assessment. The 2027 OFL increases by 4%. If instead of using this year's trawl survey index through 2016, we use the previous trawl survey index through 2016, the OFL increases by an additional 1%. So what that says is that the extension of the time series from 2016 to 2024 was a lot more influential than the analytical methods to generate the index. Next slide. We made a number of other improvements to the model, but these ultimately weren't very influential. So these improvements included a better representation of removals, a couple of new indices of abundance and recruitment, simplifications to the fleet structure, and updates to how biology is modeled. But again, these were all pretty minor changes in terms of their influence. Next slide. And here for my last slide is this figure from the at a glance that you all have available. So in the main part of the figure is the recent time series of fraction unfished since 2000 with the white background, and then into the forecast period in gray, with the inset above representing the full model time series, and our low and high states of nature from the decision table as well. The spawning output has been relatively stable in recent years, but we do estimate a slight decline due to the increase in catches from the midwater trawl fishery. And this is all consistent with how our harvest control rule is designed to work. One thing to note is that the population does increase slightly towards the end of the forecast. And this is because the new recruitment index that we use this year leads to a high recruitment estimate in 2021. And that year class starts entering the spawning population right later in the forecast. Next slide. So all of these presentations are going to conclude with the key takeaways from the at-a-glances that you all have. And from here, I'd be happy to open the floor for questions.
Thanks. So first, we're going to go to anyone in the room. Is there anyone in person that has a question or comment for Kiva? Yeah, thanks. You have to come to the table.
Sorry, Marlene, I was waiting to be called on. Dr. Oken, thank you for that. I was reading a little bit ahead in the briefing book, so maybe this is a little bit of a cheat question, but looking at the statement the GAP actually had put forward about this and just thinking about that and wondering if you could just explain for us a little bit how information from the fishery was used in the stock assessment, like how are you able to access that knowledge and how those data sets were used in how you design the assessment?
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Ridings. Great question. So we had our pre-assessment workshop in January and got a lot of great participation from the fishery there, which gave us information that we used in terms of how we designed selectivity and our selectivity blocking. And also, for the first time, I actually explored using data from the West Coast Groundfish Observer Program as an index of abundance. It's not in the model itself. We did a sensitivity model that had an index of abundance from the Observer Program. And information from the pre-assessment workshop helped me understand how to generate that index and also conversations afterwards. And ultimately, we didn't see, I didn't see any data sources that indicated an increase in the population. Even the data from the Observer Program was relatively stable to sort of had actually a similar peak to what our survey index showed. But certainly was, I would say, in recent years has been relatively stable. So those were, I think, two big sources of where we used industry information. And then I guess the other thing is during the STAR panel, we talked a lot about, we were looking at how quickly people were attaining the ACL, and we dug into that fishery dependent index a little bit more and looked at whether the groundfish trawl, like how representative the trawl survey biological data might be relative to the fishery, and they're quite similar. So even if the bottom trawl survey is obviously not perfect at sampling abundance of a semi-pelagic species, but in terms of the biology and like the sizes and ages of individuals it was capturing seemed very similar. Oh, and with regards to the West Coast Groundfish Observer Program, that was sort of a first pass at developing an index from that data. But I'm working with two other scientists from the Northwest Center, one from the Observer Program and also a statistician, to develop sort of better methods and sort of really rigorous methods for developing indices from that kind of data that's not randomly sampled. And so there's a methodology review proposal for the SSC for the next biennium. G4.
I'm curious about how you incorporate avoidance behavior. How is that captured in a stock assessment? If you know that fishermen are actively avoiding yellowtail for a variety of reasons, how is that captured in the stock assessment itself?
Yeah, so that's one downside to using an index from, for example, observer data. And that's one reason we didn't put it in the base model is because it's very hard to account for that kind of behavior. Ultimately, the stock assessment is using information from the sizes and ages of the fish that are caught to characterize the removals from the population. And then we ideally, which in the case of yellowtail we do, have fishery independent data that is sort of intended to describe more of the trends in the population. But the avoidance behavior, we're using the amount of fish that the fishery is removing, and then we're using the ages and sizes of fish that the fishery is removing. But we don't assume that the rates that they're removing at are representative of the population. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thanks for coming. I'm kind of curious about the, you're talking about the age, that SSC's recommendation with the weighting the fish relative to the size of the catch. Could you tell me what the percentage of trips are looked at? Kind of curious what are all the trips being looked at or a subsample? Do you know what that percentage is?
It's every age sample from PACFIN. So I don't know what percentage of the trips get sampled from the biological data. I would defer to, do you know, Chantal? No. But it's whatever percentage of the trips are getting sampled because it's applying to every sample that we collect. Is that?
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious as far as the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Because I know that samplers aren't always there.
Right.
And so we'd be interested to know just what that looks
Yeah.
like, I think. And then also you mentioned about the observer data. And so you say you're just looking at that now or just,
So
something new?
Yeah, so I think there's two pieces. The other thing I remembered with respect to the weighting of the samples, there's two stages. So one is the trip level. So was there a lot of fish caught in that trip relative to other trips that are sampled? But then the other, we do a second expansion where a state that maybe is sampling at a higher rate is going to have their samples down weighted relative to a state that's sampling at a lower rate, if that makes sense. With respect to the observer data, so there's two pieces I would say to the observer data. One was that I looked at the yellowtail observer data for this assessment, and that was sort of the SSC hasn't really. There's no clear guidance from the SSC on how to use observer data. It's never been used before in an assessment. And so I was sort of looking at it in a more exploratory way to see what kinds of patterns it would show and if it would confirm what we were seeing in other data sources. So that's how it was used in yellowtail. And then I think we're moving forward are interested in sort of developing more rigorous methods that do get reviewed by the SSC to potentially include these in the actual assessment models more regularly.
Cool. Thank you.
Anyone else in the room? All right. I don't see anyone else itching to ask a question yet. If you do, let's move to online remote participants. Thanks. We have a hand up. Go ahead, Jeff Lackey, please.
Yes, thank you. You referenced, I believe it was slide 5 on the difference in weighting. And you said here, let's see, I'm looking at my notes here. The samples for those fish, you said there's relatively more older fish than fewer younger fish. Are those is any of that from the bottom trawl survey? Is that all fishery data?
That's all fishery data.
Okay. And similar to widow, a lot of things that fishermen having trouble understand is, for example, widow, very similar with yellowtail, is the bottom trawling was pretty heavy in the 1990s, and a lot of it on the shelf with not near the regulations and accountability we have now. And now the shelf is very protected. And so any fishing, say midwater over the shelf, has to be very, very surgical. In fact, most of it's most of the shelf's protected. So it's unsurprising to fishermen that you have more 25 and 30-year-old fish than you used to, because they're allowed to grow up on the shelf. So a lot of fishermen see that these fishermen are able to grow up, and you see more of them. And the fact that we get these fish is a good sign to a lot in industry about the stock, but then it drives the natural mortality down. And so as far as the, I don't know how to phrase it, the scientific rigor of it being a positive sign that the natural mortality indicates that this drop we're seeing on slide number 5 needs to take place in the estimation of the unfished biomass and the current status, it doesn't make sense to a lot of us. Can you explain a little more about what is the validation that this is indeed the case, that when you have more older fish, it's a sign that the unfished biomass and the current spawning biomass is lower than it otherwise would be thought to be?
Yeah, I imagine this is really frustrating because we have more older fish than we've ever had before. But what happens is what we think is happening is that previously, we were estimating natural mortality in these stock assessments based on an artificially truncated age distribution of the population. And so as a result, we didn't think that the fish lived to be that old. And so we estimated higher rates of natural mortality. And it can be very hard to disentangle natural and fishing mortality until the population sort of makes a full trip down and then a full trip back up. And now that we sort of are seeing that full trip down and the full trip back up, or a mostly trip back up, it's a lot where our models do a better job understanding just the actual longevity of these species. But I can imagine as a fisherman, it's really frustrating because now we're like, oh, wait, these species actually live a lot longer. And so now that they're recovered, you feel like you're being punished again. The other thing I would say with respect to the way those samples were weighted, I do want to point out those comparisons I made, they were to the 2017 assessment model. So this doesn't have anything to do with new data that were collected since 2017. This was using the exact same set of age samples that were available in the last assessment, but just processing them correctly and weighting them correctly in the model. So we're not really sure why it didn't happen 8 years ago. But that change was not due to new older fish appearing.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask a second question?
Sure, go ahead.
So at the STAR panel, many fishermen testified the first day. There were a few who fished off the coast of Washington historically and have seen what they see as Heather Mann referred to avoidance measures. When you're fishing whiting, you want to avoid, or if you're going to go fish for widow, you'll maybe go to Oregon instead of fish off Washington. And so there was a couple of things during the STAR panel week, I guess, and you referenced about a CPU index, and you also referenced about seeing if accumulation, how quickly ACLs attained increased, which would have maybe corresponded to increased encounter rates. You and I actually had conversations during the year about things that would affect CPUE, such as there's a few more, at least 2 more vessels that are doing both bottom trawl and midwater, so they may target less yellowtail or less rockfish on a trip. Or there's been less larger loads, it seems like. Maybe with at the end of year, a lot of times boats are limited by what processors can take, and processors are limited by what else they're processing and how quickly they're getting ready for crab. And we're all limited by the weather that comes up in November. So a lot of times the accumulation of yellowtail is the clock runs out. Once whiting ends and the processor has extra time to process rockfish that people have left over, and the time they have to do that before other things happen, before boats have to go to shipyard, the clock runs out on us. If it wasn't for the clock running out and maybe some concerns about running into Canary, especially the last 2 years, the accumulation would be much higher. Were those things discussed when trying to ascertain whether the CPUE and the ACL attainment indicated whether or not the biomass would appear to be increasing?
Yeah, I mean, so when we looked at the ACL attainment, to be honest, we saw a big difference between before and after 2017. But since 2017, it really just seemed like it was sort of moving, randomly moving around from year to year. And there weren't any major trends that would indicate, wow, they're really attaining the ACL much faster now, or they're really attaining the ACL much slower now. It was all sort of like bouncing around some long-term average since the reopening of the fishery. I did really appreciate our conversations, and they helped me understand that observer data a lot better. And I tried to account for a lot of the things we discussed in that index. So for example, it assumes a different CPUE for each vessel. So there are some vessels that might be catching yellowtail at higher rates, some at lower rates. I even explored a model that had, there's also a day of year effect. So it assumes sometime at some points in the year, CPUE is going to be higher than at other points in the year. And I even explored a model that has a vessel specific day of year effect. So that would allow different vessels to have a vessel specific. I'm fishing harder. Some vessels might fish harder in July, and other vessels might fish harder in August. And so it would account for that sort of thing. So I really tried to look to control for a lot of different variables. And in general, what I saw in the data was just a pretty stable bouncing around population. I looked really hard to see if any sign in the data indicated a sort of an increasing population consistent with these like larger aggregations that fishermen are reporting. And I don't doubt that they are existing, but there is no data source that indicated that is happening.
Okay. Yes. Thanks for that. I guess my point in that is there are, between the avoidance rates and the clock has run out at the end of the year, or the amount or markets wanting less end up being more factors than because it's not so much a target species. It can be for a few people during the year, and it is at the very end of the year for the whiting fishermen cleaning up. So it's a bit of an oddball fishery to understand for yellowtail, but anyway, thank you for your answers.
Yeah, thanks for the questions.
Yeah, thanks. I don't see any further raised hands from the remote audience, and I think in the interest of time, we'll probably move to the next assessment. Thanks.
Okay, so next we are moving to California quillback rockfish. And so we've got Brian Langseth, who's going to tell us about that one.
All righty. Good afternoon, everyone, here in person and online. My name is Brian with the Northwest Fishery Science Center, and I am the co-lead of the California quillback rockfish stock assessment. Next slide, please. Key outputs for this assessment are shown here with age 3+ biomass on the left and fraction of unfished spawning output on the right. Based on these trajectories, the lowest point for fraction of unfished occurred in 1998 at just under 32%. In 2025, fraction of unfished was just above the management target, slightly above 40%. The model uses data for catches, lengths, ages, and indices, with ages and indices being new for this assessment. For those of you around last time it was assessed 4 years ago, you'll notice these trends are a little different from what I showed then. New information available since the last assessment have updated our understanding of quillback rockfish dynamics, and that has led to higher estimates of population size compared to that assessment. I'll talk a little bit more about the reasons for that. I want to point out in the fraction of unfished, the periods of increasing trend here in the early 2000s and then since 2023 are due to a number of large recruitment events, due in part to a number of large recruitment events. Next slide. Shown here with total recruits on the left and then deviations from the mean recruitment curve on the right. You'll see those high periods in 1993, 1994, and then again in 2016 and 2019. Age data contributed to these estimates, and the contributions of those age data to those estimates was a big topic of discussion during the STAR panel and is an uncertainty for this model. Next slide. To make the comparison with the 2021 stock assessment more explicit, these figures show the current assessment trajectories in blue compared to the 2021 assessment trajectories in red. You'll see that the current estimates are larger and estimating higher population size, as well as a larger increase in recent years, the last few decades. The reason for why these are different are multifaceted. I'm going to highlight the main points, and loosely is based on changes to productivity. And so that can come in the model in many forms. The first and primary reason is growth. You can go to the next slide. Growth was estimated externally in the model based on a number of new samples collected since the last assessment. Additionally, natural mortality was fixed in the model, but we updated our assumption around that. Those assumptions were based on a synthesis of max age values across the range of quillback rockfish, extending all the way up into Alaska. We assumed a lower maximum age, which results in a higher natural mortality. Those two factors were key drivers of the change from the 2021 assessment. Additionally, the use of age data in the model was also influential. Next slide. Both in terms of influencing recruitment patterns, but also other estimates. Age data in particular had a larger effect on those factors compared to other data types, particularly the new indices that were used in the model. Because of that, and as I mentioned before, the STAR panel really discussed this at length and talked about the uncertainties, particularly that the age data was used across a variety of sources and aggregated when put into the model. Ultimately, the STAR panel decided, and collectively we decided to not use all those sources, instead use a fair number of them. And that was a large uncertainty that they had concerns with the current model. Ultimately, it came out with the base model as I showed earlier. I will say because of that, one important data need moving forward into the future is continued collection of age and length samples, ideally through the existing and kind of standard sampling programs that are in place. The other uncertainty for our model was natural mortality. We fixed it in the base model, but estimating natural mortality increased population size, particularly in recent years. That uncertainty is shown in the next slide. With our states of nature, here again we have age 3 biomass across 3 states, our base model. In the middle, a low state of nature, assuming a low natural mortality value, a high state of nature with a higher natural mortality value. And these states are meant to encapsulate and bound structural uncertainty in the model and give us a range of plausible outcomes based on those alternative states. So for this model, that range extends from near the MSST up to well above the target, and is something to consider when looking at base model results. So with that, I am done and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Question. How long does a rockfish live? Everybody's talking about how they're just learning how long a rockfish lives. How long does a rockfish live?
That is a great question. It varies by species. For quillback, the maximum age that's in the literature is 95 years. We used 80 in our model as we thought that that bounded the uncertainty a little better. You'll actually hear future talks that have much older species. In fact, rough-eye and black-spotted. Jason, do you want to spill the beans right now?
200.
Yep. And then Jason Cope was saying for rough-eye black-spotted, there was an estimate of 205 years. So they can be very old.
Okay, thank you. How do I? Is it fine? Yeah, it's fine.
Any other questions from in-person folks? No? We'll go to the online. Any remote folks want to raise their hand, and we'll call up upon any remote questions?
Well, thank you all.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone. We're going to move on to the next stock assessment then, since we didn't have any remote questions.
And you can save them for the end. That's also okay. You can come back. So next, we're going to welcome John Field to speak to the chili pepper rockfish assessment. And I'm just going to note that I'm seeing some yawns in the room. So if we need a break to do some jumping jacks, we totally can do that in just a few minutes. So breathe deeply.
I'll try and spice things up here with chili pepper. All right. What? You'll go from yawns to groans at least. All right, I'm John Field. I'm with the Southwest Center. I'm going to be talking about, don't go to the next one yet, because I was going to point out a very cool feature for chili pepper is if you look in the upper right-hand corner of the figure. First of all, I was going to say I'm not E.J. Dick. He was the lead analyst for the assessment, but I was already here, so you're stuck with me today. Nick Grunlaw and Tanya Rogers were also on the assessment team. In the upper right-hand corner is a chili pepper rockfish that just settled out. Those are two pictures of the same fish, just a couple seconds apart. And so chili pepper and several other semi-pelagic species have this very light modeling and light coloration when they're up in the water column to blend in with the water column. As soon as they settle out onto a hard substrate, they turn dark and become more heavily modeled to help camouflage in with the dark background. So that was one thing to wake you up. Now we can go to the next slide. This one's less exciting. This is a catch trajectory of chili pepper rockfish. So they've been one of the more important commercial and recreational species in California over time. Landings peaked around 3,000 plus tons in the 80s and 90s. They dropped quite a bit, of course, as we implemented conservation measures to rebuild co-occurring boccaccio, canary, and cowcod. But they've been increasing again in more recent years. The long-term equilibrium yield probably runs right about through the middle of that at around 2,100 tons. Next slide. So these are some of the key assessment outputs with the spawning output on the left and the fraction of unfished spawning output on the right. What you can see is during that period of intensive fishing, the stock did in fact decline quite a bit. And when fishing relaxed, the stock increased pretty sharply, in fact. So a lot of that is, of course, the effects of fishing, but a lot of it is recruitment variability. Like so many other groundfish, chili pepper are driven by the population productivity is driven by large infrequent year classes that really help increase and drive the population. So you see a near tripling of the biomass in a pretty short period of time after 2000, and that was due primarily to the large strength of the 1999 year class. So the current population is much closer to the long-term unfished estimate. It's about 83% of that, and forecast to decline a little bit in the near term. So if we go to the next slide, what you see on the left is, again, the recruitment estimates coming out of the base model. And you can see those two really large year classes in there, 1984 and 1999. And again, remember that 1999 is really what caused that very sharp increase in the early 2000s. 1984 was not quite as strong, and you didn't see it as much in the population trajectory because, again, the stock was being very heavily fished, and so those fish were being fished out at a pretty high rate. You can see that in a more recent time period, we'd had more variable recruitment. Well, first of all, you can also see that the rest of the 90s were pretty horrible. Recruitment was very low, and that also contributed to that low biomass throughout the 1990s. Since that time, we've got more variable recruitment, but a lot more high years, and the most recent years, 2024, is estimated to be pretty high as well. So the right-hand side of the figure is the one that's going to take a little explanation. This is not something you're used to seeing. I'm going to do my best to walk you through it, but I think the point here is that we really want to understand what the drivers of this recruitment variability are, right? So we understand that different changes in ocean conditions are really responsible for changing the productivity and the abundance in any given year class. And so what we've identified for chili pepper is that the source waters that we have in the California current have a really strong relationship to a lot of aspects of reproductive ecology and recruitment. So essentially, when we have a lot of spicy water, and that is basically sort of equatorial water, Pacific equatorial water, that is warm, it's salty, it's low in nutrients, and low in oxygen. When we have a lot of spicy water in the California current, recruitment is poor. When we have a lot of minty water, and that's subarctic water, which tends to be a little colder, a little fresher, more oxygen-rich, and more nutrient-rich, we tend to have better recruitment. We see this both in variability in reproductive output, in the condition of larvae that go through parturition from the females, and in the abundance of the young of the year recruits in the recruitment index that's used in the model. And finally, in the bottom figure, you see that strong relationship to the recruitment estimates themselves. So the darker red the number is, the stronger the negative correlation. And what you have on the different axes there in terms of the covariates are the month and the depth related to that spiciness oceanographic index. And what you see is that the relationship is really strong in early spring. And that's because that's when those fish are out in the water column before they settle out, and that's when survival is at the most variable level, and that's when we think a lot of the variability in year class strength is actually set. The other thing that's kind of interesting is depth is on the y-axis, and the relationship between these source waters and recruitment is a subsurface relationship. So it's not a relationship to what we see at the surface waters, what we're seeing in the satellites. It's a relationship to things that are subsurface and reflect these larger kind of low frequency variability and large scale water mass transport. So that's a mouthful. I understand that. I think the bottom line is that chili pepper, in addition to being delicious, are a really good study animal, and we're doing a lot of work to really understand what the dynamics driving the population productivity and the recruitment processes actually are. And there's a little more spiciness, mintiness primer within the assessment and the risk table discussion in case you want to add those to your vocabulary. That's probably enough of that. I can go to the next slide. And this is a little easier one. This is a comparison to the previous assessment, the 2017 catch update. Sorry, not catch update, complete update assessment. And what you see is the age 1 biomass between the current model and the 2017 model track each other very, very closely. And this is also equally true if you go all the way back to the 2007 benchmark assessment. Chili pepper are a reasonably well-behaved stock with respect to sort of how the model estimates are consistent from assessment to assessment. Next slide. This is just some of the model uncertainty and projections information. So the base model is there in blue. Steepness was considered to be the major axis of uncertainty for this population. Steepness, again, drives the productivity, our estimates of productivity of the stock. As well, the low state of nature is shown in red. So if we assume a low steepness value, it means the historical biomass had to be quite a bit higher to support the landings that we observed. If we assume this high state of nature value, this high steepness value, that's the green line. We think the stock will be in better shape, and it started from a slightly lower value. The base model in red to the right has the 10-year projections, forecast years, forecast with either the ABC-ACL catch assumptions or the equilibrium MSY catch assumptions. If you assume that the next 10 years will be more aligned with the equilibrium MSY catches, then the stock is going to decline at a much slower rate than if the entire OFL. But the whole idea is, as Kiva pointed out, is that the management strategy is to fish it down close to this equilibrium MSY level and the corresponding output. I think that's all I have on this one. We could go to the next slide with some of the takeaways, and if you would like your primer on spiciness and mintiness now, or if that didn't wake you up, you can just kick me off the stage and I'll leave.
Thanks. Come on up. Are there any questions? We've got a couple questions in the room.
I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on what are the characteristics that lead to a well-behaved assessment versus a not so well-behaved assessment?
Oh, well, that's a great question, and it's a complicated question. But informative indices are certainly a part of that. When we have indices of abundance that we can fit with the population model, that suggests that there isn't a mismatch between our empirical data, our observed data, and what the model would like to see. When we have compositional data, age and length compositional data, that can be fit very well by the model, that the model is essentially seeing the same thing we're seeing on the water, that's also a very good indication. And I think having some contrast tends to be associated with well-behaved. The idea that when we don't know something, and you're going to hear about that one, I think, next or in 2 assessments from now, when we don't know how far, if we don't think there's been intensive fishing pressure on a stock, and we don't have this kind of, contrast in stock abundance, that's a consequence of fishing, it becomes very difficult to forecast or predict or even understand what the consequences of future fishing is going to be on that population. So save that part for Jason's talk, because I think we're going to hear a little more about that and a not as well-behaved assessment. Sorry, has nothing to do with the analysts when we get to rough eye black spotted.
This is pretty dangerous. I'm an economist, so I'm going to have a pretty dumb question. Under major changes from recent assessments, number 7, fleets as areas approach. I'm sorry, Dr. Field, if you perhaps explain that, but that's modeling differences in fish length for catches along the West Coast. Does that mean you're looking at the actual imprint where the fleets are operating? And also, under the first assessment, yellowtail rockfish, we learned that the weight of the different, the information you got from sampling was different, depending on how much catch was on that trip or what the sampling rate was by state. Is that done for all of these assessments? And is it done in particular for this one? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'll answer the second one first because that's easy. Yes, we did use the same catch-weighted approach for chili pepper. I do think there have been some examples in the past where we didn't always do that. I think they tend to be a little further back in time. So I don't think it was unprecedented to not do that, but I think it's typically done that we do catch weight the compositional data. The fleets as areas approach is merely, I think the idea there is that in different parts of the coast, the fleets will tend to have different selectivity patterns. Sometimes that's because of fishing behavior, sometimes that's because of possibly fish movement patterns where you have larger, older fish either in deeper water or in the northern part of the range relative to smaller, younger fish in the south. So to better account for that and to avoid kind of complicated or poorly estimating selectivity curves, we often take a fleet and have a trawl fleet in the south and a trawl fleet in the north. that helps us better fit the data and understand what the fleet is catching relative to what's available. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm looking at the summary and noting the takeaway that you've removed 2 fishery-dependent indices of abundance, and it appears that this assessment is relying heavily on fishery-independent surveys. I see you've added Cal Coffee, and I'm just wondering, is this an appropriate data stream that might help us inform other assessments? And is it because chili pepper or midwater rockfish, or what is your thought on Cal Coffee data as an independent index for other stocks?
Thank you, Marcy. That's a great question. I'll start with the Cal Coffee question. I do think it's a great index for some stocks. The challenge with Cal Coffee, for rockfish at least, is that only a small number of larvae can be easily morphologically identified from the plankton samples. You can actually go in and do genetic identification of some of the larvae, and they've actually done that for a small subset in a smaller time period. But for chili pepper, they have been morphologically identified going as far back as 1951 in that time series, and that basically is the strength of the time series is that it gives us information for the 1950s, 60s, and 70s before we had any of our other fishery independent survey information. With respect to the fishery dependent surveys, so the trawl logbook index that was in some of the earlier assessments, it was actually unchanged in the 2007 assessment. It was developed by Ralston in 1996 for the 1998 assessment, and it was not based on a species-specific catch rate. It was just rockfish, kind of apportioned to the right species composition. So we had some questions about that. The other fishery-dependent index from the 2007 assessment was from the Cal Fish and Wildlife Onboard Observer Study between 1987 and 1998, Deb Wilson-Vandenberg study. We ultimately decided that some of the information there was a little thin because the recreational fleet was not focusing on chili pepper in Central California, so there was a small number of positive observations. And really the effectiveness of both of those indices is one was a little more optimistic, one was a little more pessimistic. They essentially canceled each other out. We did some sensitivity tests, those are included in the document, and it really didn't change the bottom line as much. So we thought it was safer to kind of leave them out and leave them for kind of revisiting at a future time, or never.
Follow up real
Yes.
fast? Thank you. So is this the only assessment that relies so heavily on independent indices to drive the outcome?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think a large number of our stock assessments rely primarily on the fishery independent survey data, much more than fishery dependent data. I think the nearshore species tend to be those stocks that rely much more heavily on fishery dependent data because we don't have nearshore surveys. But for the stocks that have good survey coverage, it's mostly West Coast Bottom Trawl survey, but for a handful, it does include Cal Coffee. So Boccaccios and the other rockfish that has used the Cal Coffee data for quite some time, and Cal Cod uses it as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else in the room? If not, I'd also ask the remote participants, please go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Just want to give them a moment. Trying to prompt remote folks, once we get to the question and answer period, feel free to raise your hand right away so that we can know that you're waiting. And I don't see any remote questions at this time. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to do one more and then we're going to take a break. So next up, we have Sablefish with Chantel Wetzel, and I'm going to let Chantel take it away.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. Hi, I'm Chantel Wetzel. I'm the lead stock assessment scientist for this year's Sablefish assessment. I had a large number of brilliant scientists helping me on this assessment. I want to highlight, I have one of them in the room, Cheryl Barnes from OSU, is also among the stat on this assessment. Next slide, please. Or next slide. Thank you. So first, I want to, on the left side, I'm showing age 3+ biomass, and on the right side, fraction of unfished spawning outputs. So this year's assessment estimates that the age 3 biomass drops pretty dramatically in the 70s and 80s when removals were the greatest, varies around a lower level during the 90s and 2000s, and then is shooting up quite rapidly at the end of the time series, driven by a number of above average recruitments. This fraction unfished really kind of mirrors the trend in the H3 biomass, with at the end of the time series, the population dramatically going up due to some very large recruitments becoming mature and contributing to the spawning output at the end of the time series, with the model estimating in 2025 that the stock is just under 34% of unfished, and is projected to be at 40% by the start of 2027. Next slide. So as I mentioned, recruitment has been a real big driver in recent years in this stock. I want you to take away a couple things from this slide. I'm showing the total recruitment by year being estimated from this year's assessments, with that dashed horizontal line showing equilibrium, kind of average recruitment across all years in the model. And that the first thing I want to highlight is that in recent years, particularly since 2020, 4 out of the 5 years of recruitment has been estimated to be well above the average recruitment. The other part I want to highlight here is that a number of those strong year classes that are coming into the population are not yet at the size of 50% maturity or greater. So they're not quite contributing to spawning output yet, but they will be, and that is partly why we see the forecasted removals from this model going up a little bit during the projection period and then coming back down as we fish down the stock. Okay, next slide. So I want to acknowledge that this assessment is quite a bit different from other recent assessments of sablefish. And that was due to many different reasons, but I want to highlight 4 here that were kind of the critical pieces that led to differences in this year's assessment. The first one, we identified a large number of historical age data that were collected in the 80s and 90s that did not appear to be used in the more recent assessments. So we went ahead and added those into the model, and those primarily came from Oregon, and the pattern in those data were really consistent with the other age data that were being used in the model. But now with larger sample sizes, the model was estimating a larger drop in historical stock trajectory, which resulted in overall lower stock status. Additionally, new survey data and model structure changes resulted in a change in the selectivity being estimated for the West Coast groundfish bottom trawl survey. The current model is estimating that sablefish age 2+ have about an 80% probability of being captured when encountered by the survey. And this change in the selectivity estimated resulted in a lower estimate of stock status. The next piece, recruitments. This assessment estimates that that 2020 and 2021 year class are still quite large, but it is reduced relative to the previous assessment. And so this lower estimate of recruitments in those 2 years has reduced the projected harvest limits compared to the previous assessment. And then the final piece I want to highlight is growth, that we moved to an empirical weighted age approach, which allows us to better capture variation in growth across the coast and across time. And so this allows us to better capture the biology and that changing biology of sablefish by year in space. And this really had only a negligible effect on stock size and status estimate, but really greatly improved model stability. Next slide. And so looking at the model uncertainty and the projections here, I'm showing the fraction unfished from the base model and the 2 low and high states of nature. The base model is shown there in that middle line in blue, where, as I said, it's projected to hit that management target of 40% in 2027, and then increase a little bit as those recruitments become mature and contribute to spawning output. And then the base model comes down a bit at the end of the projection period. And the piece I want to highlight here, the low and high state of nature really brackets the stock from being right around the minimum stock size threshold to being at the management targets in 2025, and that the low state of nature has the stock potentially being within the precautionary zone using a P-star of 0.45, and that is well within the base model uncertainty. All right, next slide. And so with that, I will open the floor for questions, and I've got the key takeaways that are also in your at a glance on the slide above.
Okay, I have another very basic question. What is a recruitment?
Oh, great question. So recruitment is our term for young of the year class, like new fish entering or being born a certain year. So we've had multiple years where that amount of young fish being born each year has been really large, and that they seem to be surviving to enter into that population that's going to be fished and become mature.
So recruitment is the number of baby fish being born, or recruitment is the number of baby fish being born and then surviving to become adults?
So they have to survive a little bit for us to see them in our data. We don't often see those brand new baby fish like Dr. Field was just talking with the Cal Coffee survey that does, we call them young of year. So those are like really tiny young fish. For sablefish, we see those small, just born this year fish primarily first in September or so in our bottom trawl survey, and they're about 25 centimeters long. So they have to remain alive to that size for us to start seeing them and to, be counted.
Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. Oh, come on down, Dr. Punz.
You've published all your thesis chapters, so that question's gone.
Gave me my degree. You can't take it back.
Yeah, so there were two questions that sort of unrelated to adopting the assessment, but more sort of philosophical. The first one relates to the correct decision, I think, to moving to the weighted age approach. But the first question that I've got for you is, how does that change monitoring needs? Because in the past, for most of these assessments, we're relying on age and length data, and the length data are what you put in when you don't have enough ages. Have you sort of worked out what that term enough ages means? Because now you're trying to estimate age structure and mean weighted age. And what are the likely implications for doing that? Part two question is, and I raised it during the review, is you've thrown out the lengths.
Yes.
So ignorance is bliss, right? So you don't have it in the model, so we don't need to think about it. We had that inconsistency last time, and obviously you got rid of it because if you don't ask, you don't have to worry about the inconsistency. But is there any sense of what it was and why we've solved it? Well, we've solved it because we got rid of it, but I'm looking for more. What was the inconsistency? So two questions.
Okay, perfect. So I will start on the ambiguous term of enough ages, because that is really an undefined term. Right now, given the fishery collections and full efforts of the West Coast Groundfish Bottom Trawl Survey, we are collecting what I would consider enough, sufficient ages at the current sampling intensity. If that was to go away from either of those data sources, that would be a great concern of how to update that empirical weighted age going forward for this assessment. Additionally, continuing to have sampling across the coast from both the fishery and the survey is also really, really important, aside from just the quantity. And so that really also depends upon our ability to collect the data, but then to all continue to have agers to then read that data and to put that in the assessment. The other part with linked data, my intuition is that, so lengths and ages in this assessment historically has given different signals and kind of telling the model to go one way with one data set and the other with another. I believe that was really being driven by variable growth across space and time that wasn't really being accounted for in the assessment, given that we were assuming a fixed growth curve, that model was getting very mixed signals depending upon how many linked data are coming from California, Oregon, or Washington. And while we still have that variation in biology, the approach to calculate the weighted age accounted for in that model space and time. So we're trying better to get at and weight the portion of biomass across the coast in each area where you do have that variable growth better to better account for that.
Definitely an A- for that last one.
Hey, I think that's the best grade Andre's ever given me.
All right, I'm jumping in here. I'm jumping in, cutting Andre off. So just to build on what Chantel was saying, because I think this is a really good discussion around the empirical weighted age approach. You know, we have another assessment that we do this for, and that is the Pacific hake assessment. And so that's another example of a species where we collect a lot of data and information for. And so it makes sense if when in these situations when we have reliable survey information and reliable information coming from the fisheries, and we think that there is a lot of variability in growth, to move to these kinds of approaches like empirical weighted age. And I would just say, Chantel, having worked at both of those assessments, has really excellent perspective on this. And so I'm very supportive of this decision.
Thanks. I have another question related to the empirical weighted age. My question is, how do you use it? What do you do for projections? You're just using the average, and if there is density dependence, you mentioned there is variation in weighted age, and there's been talk about density dependence, and how does that affect projections?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Holland. Good question. Because age data, we used really the survey age data to inform the empirical weighted age, because that gives us the best coverage in terms of coast-wide and depth. But that means your data really only start in 2003 to inform this. And so the stat had lots of conversations, and we took kind of a similar approach that the Pacific hake assessment does, that we calculated, a long-term average between 2003 through 2024, where we had annual data, and used that average for the historical, so anything 2002 and earlier. And then for the projection period, we calculate a recent average. I believe we used the last 5 years to try to capture the current growth patterns in the population and assume that for that projection period.
Okay, thank you.
Dale, thank you for coming here and sharing. Great to see you as always. I've been involved in the groundfish fishery for 40 years,
A little
bit. And I got to say that when I saw the results of the survey, I was kind of taken back a little bit. And, it's, what the real number is, we'll never know, but this is your best estimate from what you got. I get that. But I'm really intrigued by the stock status the last 30 years.
Yeah.
As how, this is all learning time for everybody. And I'm just kind of wondering, as far as how we manage stocks, because we've got these cutoffs, minimum stock threshold, and we, 10% now things are stopping. And I'm seeing here that we're really close to where, if we would have known, we would have curtailed virtually all fishing on the shelf for a number of years. But this stock did not collapse, and we had a very robust fisheries for 30 years. It kind of makes me wonder just are we doing things right? So looking at things properly
Mhm.
as what these stocks, everybody talks about risk, right? And so I'm not really thinking about it as a fisherman, I'm thinking as a manager about how do we best manage fisheries in the West Coast. And if this is an accurate description of what happened, I think we need to probably take a really hard look at just how we manage fisheries. Because this stock came back without any help from us, in essence, because we didn't stop the fishery, and is doing quite well. And so I just, anyway, I just want to bring that up as far as it's just an interesting look, because I think that I know you do good work, and I really appreciate all the work, your time coming here and talking to us, and look forward to for many years ahead. So thank you.
Yeah, I don't, well, you didn't have a direct question. I think, and you don't have to continue to sit there, Brad. But I think you raised some really good points, and that I, as a stock assessor, and having seen many sablefish stock assessments, I had lots of anguish when I was getting this answer, like, this can't be correct. I know this is wrong. What did I do wrong? And that, us as a stat went over that on months, and we realized it's really the better model structure and allowing the model to fit the data better that gave us this very different answer. And that I'm glad we did this now rather than, say, 15 years ago, where that would have been a really dire management implication. That right now we've got really good recruitment coming to the population, and that has kind of saved us. And I think that pattern of strong recruitment helping us, and us not really knowing how, that we actually needed that, is a common message across many of our ground fish. That I think, strong recruitment in different years for sablefish has really helped us. But also, since, mid-2000s, catches have been quite a bit lower than they were historically. So kind of those two pieces together really helped us to not have a much more dire outcome from this assessment. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. So just to be equitable, I just want to make sure that we have an opportunity to have any questions from the remote participants. Can you go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question about sablefish at this time? Thanks. I see a question from Merritt McCrae. Please go ahead.
Tricky. First, I couldn't unmute, and then when I was able to, I pushed the button and I muted myself. Hi, this is Merritt McCrae. I'm with the Groundfish Advisory Subpanel. This is great discussion here, and I just want to thank those of you in the room who've asked the hard questions, and Chantel for the great answers. My ask here is to include a slide from section 8.11 in the assessment to go with your key changes from the previous assessment. And there are a couple of slides there, and they basically show the differences between the trajectories of the previous assessments and this one. I know that we have that for a lot of this presentation for the other species, and I think it would be important to show here too. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Merritt. I might send you a question about that offline. I really appreciate that suggestion, and I'm sorry I don't have the opportunity to see you in person here at this meeting. You wrote that down too? Yeah. Okay. Oh. Well. Oh, sorry. It wasn't clear if you had a clear question or a request there, because I don't have that figure in front of me. So can you give me, if you do have a question and you would like me to speak to it, give me a little bit more information of what you're looking at so I can remember in that very, very long document that we produced that you clearly have looked at very closely, and I appreciate that.
Oh, I'm assuming that's for me. And
Yeah.
so it's figures 134 on 239 pages at this point and more, and figure 135. And what they show are the basically what the different models over the years were, the assessment years, so 2005, 2007, 2011, 2015, 19, 21, 23, and 25. And maybe there's a lot of lines there. Maybe not all those lines that are needed, because it makes it a little bit, there's a lot there. It's busy. But it would be pretty, the easiest thing I think would be just to add one of these into your presentation.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And I agree. There are a ton of lines there because we have done many assessments over the years for sablefish. And yeah, I think this really tells the story. While this assessment has a more steep drop in the trajectory compared to previous assessments, there is a similar pattern of that really the fishery in the 70s and 80s when it was quite big with the foreign fleet and the domestic fleet really driving that population down. But this one estimates that drive down was a bit more extreme than previous assessments had estimated. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I'm not there to be able to see it face to face too. Great presentation and super answers.
Great. Thank you, Merritt.
I don't see any other questions from remote folks. So did you want to take a short coffee break? Okay. What time would we like to come back?
Let's see, it's 2:22. Let's say 2:35. Okay, grab a cup of coffee, do some jumping jacks, go outside, ask more questions. We'll be back.
huge abundance, it seems, they are marketable. When you catch them, they are valuable. And there are some folks out there that have been able to target them, even though that they aren't typically targeted. Some folks have targeted them. So there is this potential to where this could turn into something that folks could turn their attention to. So I want to bring that up because we have what we typically see as a very long-lived species that can worry us, low catches, with the potential, because they are valuable, to open up a fishery. Okay, so this is going to become important here in a moment. Lastly, the last time it was assessed, unlike sablefish, where you saw lots and lots of lines, 2013 was the last time this was assessed. Next slide. Thank you. So some of these key outputs, you will notice there on the left side, a very unexciting, mostly looking flat. One of the reasons it mostly looks flat, it is actually going down a little bit, but you can see that there is a broken bar on the top end of that middle line that you see, and that is the uncertainty. We have high uncertainty in how many of these two species are out there. What we have more certainty about, though, is that right-sided plot there where we have the stock status, and you can see relative to our management target of 40%, we are well above it. We think we are well above it. And this is very consistent with other assessments that have been done for these two species together up in Alaska. They do them for two different regions. All of those assessments also say that the population is really doing quite well. It's hard to know how many of them are out there, though. Next slide. One of the reasons we just can't tell, and John mentioned this earlier, is that when you spend a lot of time with uncertainty above, and I've highlighted it here, hopefully you can see that kind of whatever color that is up at the top there, you can see there's a long portion, basically the whole time series, really, I could highlight the whole time series, is at or above unfished. When you see that in your assessment, you really don't have an idea of how many fish are out there. So while we can say this stock seems healthy, when it comes to setting catches, it's going to be trickier. Next slide. So some of the changes that happened from 2013 until now, a lot more information. We extended the catch history. And very importantly, we changed the way the fleet structure was. And this, I think, Jeff Lackey and others who we were able to talk through how people are fishing, some of the emerging fisheries that were out there, and really putting together a fleet structure we felt good about. In addition to that, we updated how we think people were fishing rough eye and black spotted, which means there's a bit more of a dome shapeness in many of these trawl fisheries, which makes complete sense. These things are in the rocks, they're harder to get to, and therefore you're probably not going to get some of the bigger ones that are deeper in on the rocks. We added a lot more, thousands of more ages, which was really important. The ages, the addition of the ages updated our status. You will see the comparison. The last assessment, while still saying that the stock was healthy and above target, was not as high as this. The lengths tended to bring the stock status down. The new ages brought them up. But the length data are super important in this assessment because they told us when the recruitments were coming in, and they also helped us estimate the selectivities in the fishery. So we understood how people were fishing. We had very robust estimates of growth. Those lengths and ages together really helped us consistently estimate growth, which was the same that we would estimate outside the model. But there was some uncertainty in natural mortality, which is very common in our stock assessments. The other thing that we had a challenge with is these things are old and they're not easy to age, and we want to really thank our aging labs, both federal and state, for doing a heck of a job of getting all of these thousands of ages to us. But they're still uncertain. There's a fair bit of aging error and lots of different types of aging error, which is no fun to work with in an assessment. Next slide, please. And so here's the comparison. The upper line is our new assessment. And again, we're looking at this in relative form. So this is relative to an unfished state. And so you can see that the last assessment thought it was above target, but much closer to the target, where the addition of those ages have pushed up. They see a lot more older individuals in the population, therefore the status is higher. Our major sources of uncertainty were, again, natural mortality, and then that choice of the selectivity. That updating selectivity, though, allowed us to actually fit the data. If we used the old selectivity, we just couldn't fit the data. The ways that we would like to reduce uncertainty here, again, it's hard to set catch limits when you have so much uncertainty in the scale, is we need to increase age samples, not just in the future, but going back in the past, if we can age more, we still have more samples that we can age, and working on improving the aging error. Next slide. Thank you. Final slide here for you to talk with. Here are our states of nature, again, built around natural mortality. The one thing I want to point out here is, one, all of them are pretty certain that the population is doing well and is above the above the management target. But on the scale side, on that left side, notice that lower state of nature. Look how much the scale has shrunk. That's because that one actually brings you below, for most of the time series, below the unfished level, and then voila, you have an idea of what the scale is. And so this is a nice illustration of the fact that you run into a challenge when you are trying to assess something that is at such a high stock status. You might have a hard time setting catch limits. So we'll go to the next slide. I'll leave it at that with these takeaways, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you have. Thanks. Okay.
So we heard this for yellow eye,
Mhm.
that we've got older fish, and the conclusion was we're in worse shape. You just said we got older fish and we're in better shape.
Yeah.
Right. Explain why those two operate.
Yellowtail.
Yellowtail, whatever the thing is.
Disqualified. Well, Andre, I don't know if I can tell you exactly why right this second without sitting down. I mean, these assessments are quite complex, and they got.
But it does seem like an inconsistency when you use the same sentence with a different conclusion.
Right. If we were only using ages in the assessments, and both of them had older individuals, and one showed one go down, the other one go up, that would be strange. These are obviously, Kiva, you had a fair bit. I mean, there is that sort of thing. We were actually able to estimate natural mortality, so there was some contrast. One thing I will say, Andre, is that in this assessment, a very unique thing, it's interesting. We don't have a lot of data, but the combination of fishery data, and I should say our survey isn't a great, it's not a good indicator of abundance for this stock, like tracking the abundance, but the biological compositions coming from our index are absolutely key to this assessment. It tells us the recruitment and helps us do growth. But what it also does is it fills in the blank in what we see in the population. In this assessment, our midwater fisheries see the older individuals really, really well. All of our trawl fisheries do not see those, but they see the young, small ones really well. And when you overlay all of those selectivities on top of each other, you actually get a picture of the whole population. And so, Andre, I can't specifically tell you, and if you have an answer to it, I would love it. But what I can tell you is that with this particular assessment, seeing more older individuals allows us to overcome the deficiency in using mostly lengths, which is what happened in the last assessment, because what happens in the growth curve, they grow, and then they sit at this size for decades and decades. And you don't know how old they are. With these new ages, we now know how old they are, and they're dang old. And there's a fair bit of them, it seems, out there. But we do have some uncertainty. So that was I don't know what that was, Andre. I answered some question someone had somewhere, right? Thanks. Anyone else?
Go ahead. We've got another one in the room.
Hey, Corey.
Yeah, hi, Corey Niles, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. It feels weird to be so close to you, to talking to a microphone. But this well, I got maybe a two-part question, but I've heard you all say for a long time, it's easier often to estimate status than how big the population is. When it's, oh, my brain goes like, oh, how, if you don't know where how can you'd have to know where you started to know where you are now. So is that true? Because basically you're seeing in this case that the ages are pretty similar to what you would expect in an unfished population.
Yeah. I think conceptually, Corey, this is a really good question because this kind of breaks down what do our different data types tell us. If you look at, there are ways in which you can take lengths and or ages and only kind of use those to get a rough estimate of kind of stock status. And the reason being is exactly what you said. If you know what the life history is, if you know how they grow and you know when they mature and you know their natural mortality, assuming those things, you can set up what you think an unfished population looks like theoretically. You don't know how many of those are out there, but you know proportionally how much would be in each length and age class. And if you compare that to what you're seeing in the fish population, you can calculate basically how much spawning potential or mature biomass you have lost. That's why we're able, without even knowing how many fish are out there, to have a rough idea of what's left. But we need catches, and we need to put catches on top of that to really figure out how many are out there. How many did it take, and how do you fish that gets you to that stock status? In this assessment, unfortunately, it's saying, well, you might be at 80%, but you could also be at 110%. And if you're at 110%, you could have way more fish versus way more fish, right? It's like you just got lots of fish and I don't know how many are out there. But that's why we can sometimes we often do a better job at our stock status estimates and still don't have a clue what's out there. And so we just have to be careful setting catch limits on something that we don't know the scale too bad. Yeah.
And that was my second, when you said that, and I heard you say the star panel. So you typically have this, we have a sigma and the P-star approach, and think that's good enough to be safe. So, and then Brad's example of the sablefish and how had we had this assessment result, we would have been a rebuilding plan, and yet we had it. So
right.
I'm hearing reason for people to think about, can you just elaborate on what the council and folks may want to think about? Why would setting an ACL for this be different?
Yeah, and I don't want to overstep kind of where I'm sitting at the table here now into other things, but I will highlight the fact that this is a long-lived, late to mature, like 20-something years. That's when they mature. It's got a lot of elements that could put it into trouble. It also seems to have some natural refugia, like people just aren't getting at them. We don't know how much that's balanced. And so the fact that we don't know the scale going really high and trying to catch as many as possible might not be the best way to prosecute a resource like this. But also on the flip side, there's no evidence that says you should be limiting a bunch of fisheries because of this, right? So I just think there should be some thoughtfulness in recognizing that upper scale. And the other thing is, when are we going to do this next, right? And so I appreciate that other challenge on the layer of this. It's not just, well, we'll just go get a bunch more ages and we'll do what you said and lower uncertainty and have a better catch limit in 2 years. We're not going to be doing this in 2 years, unlikely. And so how do we balance the fact that when are we going to get an updated view of this stock? When are we going to get that data? We talked about the challenges of getting the data. And what do we do in the meantime? So I'm with you on this challenge, please.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add to what Jason is saying. I don't know if the SSC's report is out yet, but when I saw on this one, they're recommending a category 2 sigma, so higher scientific uncertainty buffer, and I believe there's a statement in there about recommending that council take under consideration the uncertainty when they're considering their selection of the P-star values. So.
Thanks, Corey.
Do we have any remote participants that want to raise their hand and ask a question relative to this assessment? I'm not seeing any raised hands online. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we are going to move on from our benchmark assessments to our update assessments. And so we have 2 of those, and we're going to start with yellow eye rockfish. And we've got Kiva Oken back up here to give us an overview on that one.
Hello, everyone. I'm back. In addition to leading the yellowtail benchmark assessment, I was also one of the co-instructors of the applied stock assessment course this past year that produced the update assessments. So I'm here now to present results from the yellow eye rockfish update assessment, which I have been confusing for the last 9 months. So Andre, you're in good company. I do want to point out that this assessment was co-led by Morgan Johnston, who's a PhD student at Oregon State, and Claire Rosemond, who is a relatively new hire at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center between the stock assessment and survey programs. And it had, along with a host of collaborators who were grad students, postdocs, and state agency staff. And then you'll also notice there are 4 co-authors at the end who are all Northwest Center stock assessment scientists and regularly lead stock assessments. Next slide, please. So this is an update of the 2017 benchmark assessment. And catches have increased modestly since then, which is all in line with the rebuilding plan. But this increase in catches has provided a fair bit of additional age and length composition data to help us understand the population a little better. And as a reminder, like rough eye and black spotted rockfish, yellow eye is very long-lived and takes a very long time to mature and become selected in the fishery. So on the left, you see roughly the selected biomass doesn't start until about age 8. And our estimate of biomass of fish age 8 and older in 2025 is just over 5,000 metric tons. And this is associated with a fraction of unfished spawning output of 40.1%, which is just above the target of 40%. And we definitely dotted all our I's and crossed all our T's as we were finalizing this assessment model. And this is definitely our best estimate of the fraction of unfished. I do want to point out that we very easily could have ended up at 39.9%, for example. Next slide, please. So these figures compare spawning output on the left and fraction unfished on the right of the 2017 assessment in blue and the current update assessment in red. And the trajectory of relative spawning output, which that's the one on the right, so fraction unfished, is very similar to what we saw in 2017 and is just sort of an extension of the rebuilding timeline. However, on the left, you can see that the overall size of the population is a little bit higher in this assessment, so that I think would likely lead to higher projected OFLs. And this is largely due to the addition of that new composition data that I mentioned that sort of changes our perception of the scale of the population. Next slide, please. And then here are the results from the 3 states of nature that we used in the decision table. So the axis of uncertainty, like with many of our assessments, is natural mortality. And in this assessment, I think the only assessment that you've seen today that fixes natural mortality is Quillback. So in this assessment, once again, we don't have enough age data to really get a good picture of how old these fish can get and estimate that internally in the model. So we fix natural mortality in this assessment using an assumed longevity of about 123 years. Then the low state of nature, which is in green, has a natural mortality that's associated with a longevity of 147 years. This is the maximum age that yellowtail rockfish has ever been aged at. It's a lot, yeah. Oh, yellow eye rockfish has ever been aged at. And the high state of nature in red has a natural mortality associated with a maximum age of 97, which is the 99th percentile of the age data that were available in 2017. So we're using the same states of nature as were used in 2017. These states of nature were intentionally chosen to be all reasonably plausible. So I really want to emphasize here is the possible range of where the population could be. For example, even though assuming this assessment is adopted, the population should be declared rebuilt. In the low state of nature in green, we can see that the population is barely above the minimum stock size threshold. So I think just keeping in mind that sort of uncertainty, and as we open these fisheries, presumably we'll be able to collect more data and get a better picture of where the population is at. But once we collect that additional data, the picture could change. That is all I have. So I'll take any questions.
Okay, so this question's slightly leveled up. How do you age a specimen? Like, I've heard of people using like the spine, like the vertebrae of a spine, to like the rings in it to age like shark skeletons. But how do you age the skeleton of a yellow eye rockfish?
Great question. So their ear bones, they're called otoliths. They actually have little rings on them, like a tree. And I've actually never done this, but you can put them under a microscope, and you can count the number of rings on the otolith to tell you how old the fish is. And now they have slightly more you can sort of break the otolith in half and burn it, and that can make the lines, the contrast in the lines a little bit better, so you can age them a little bit more reliably. But that's generally how we age fish. It's just like a tree. They use their ear bone.
Is one ring in the ear bone 1 year or?
Yes, exactly. That's what we hope. We have confirmed it. We can use sort of like radioisotopes from the atmosphere to sort of help us confirm that one ring is actually 1 year. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Appreciate y'all being here and doing this. I'm going to ask you to put yourself in my shoes later this week. At 40.1% rebuilt on an update assessment, how risky do you think that is? Would you, go to the full, whatever, 129 metric tons? Or based on what you know, would you prefer to be, would you want to be a little precautionary until we can do maybe a full benchmark with some of that additional age data?
I mean, I don't have to choose P-Star, which is a delightful part of my job. But I think that you're thinking about the right things, that we are right at the target. And I think that opens up a lot of opportunities, which are really, I think rebuilding plans are really restrictive. And so that's nice that you've sort of been freed from that really strict rebuilding plan. But I do think a future assessment could look very different than this assessment. And there, the fishery is going to collect data, and that's going to give us a better picture, but it could look different. Yeah.
And I think, as Kiva has noted in her intro remarks, with yellow eye being so long-lived and just inherently vulnerable, from a population perspective, that's probably likely something that SSC is considered in their comments around this assessment, and I suspect that the council will probably also be considering.
That'd be a bummer to throw it back under a rebuilding plan when you, next time you assess it.
Yeah, thanks. I did see a hand raised from a remote participant. Tom, were you still interested in asking a question? Please go ahead at this time if you'd like.
Yeah, okay. I don't know whether to ask it now or later. I was on the Gap for like over about a dozen years, from 12 to like 21 or something or other. And during that time, Yellow Eye was predicted to be rebuilt like in 2072 and Canary like 2052. And about 17 Canary turned out it was rebuilt already and had been maybe for a decade. And now we see the Yellow Eye just 8 years later is now rebuilt. Now we've seen that Quillback 2 years ago was declared, overfished, and now it's rebuilt 2 years later. It just seems like maybe we're making such pessimistic, conservative views on the stock that, are just unrealistic. And the damage this causes economically is really severe. We've been shut down for the last couple of years now because of this Quillback issue, and it just seems like, how can these fish be rebuilding so quickly when they're not predicted to be for decades? I mean, it used to be if our grandkids got to fish Yellow Eye, it'd be surprising. Now we're on the cusp that maybe they might allow one or something, and it just puzzled. How can we be so far off on these predictions, or are we just being so incredibly pessimistic, unrealistically? And this is causing a lot of economic damage.
I'm going to let my boss take that one.
Well, I think there's two pieces of this that I'm hearing. So maybe I will ask Kiva if she wants to say anything specific about Yellow Eye, about why it might be rebuilding quicker than at least initially expected. And then we can spend a little bit of time on I think the broader question about assessment uncertainty and changes from one assessment to the next, and how that is so challenging to deal with in our process, and all the different pieces at play there. So maybe the specific part first.
Yes. So specifically to Yellow Eye, I think in 2017, the last time that it was assessed, based on that rebuilding plan and that rebuilding analysis, the stock was projected to rebuild around now. So relative to 2017, it's rebuilding around when we expected. There are a lot of, so one big thing that changed throughout sort of like the mid 2010s in our assessment process was our perception of steepness of the stock recruit relationship, which means, we know that when there's no fish in the population, there's going to be no recruitment. And we know that when there's at some sort of unfished biomass, that's going to be a lot of recruitment. And what we don't know is how that curves down. We don't know if recruitment can stay very high at low population levels, or if it's sort of a straight line between the unfished recruitment and this no fish, no recruitment. And so our perception of steepness has changed such that we think that actually rockfish can produce quite large year classes at fairly low population sizes. And so that's one big difference between the 2017 assessment and the assessments previous that has allowed it to rebuild more quickly. And then I'll let Dr. Marshall answer the more general question.
Thanks, Kiva. Yeah, and I'll take a stab at this, and I think maybe it would be a good one to circle back on in our more open discussion too. So this is a really hard problem, right? And the stock assessment scientists and the Science Center, we fully recognize that there are very real world implications of our assessment results that we bring into this process. And I think that our role in this is really to do our best to fit the data that's available, produce the best assessment we can, and then accurately and transparently quantify and communicate the uncertainty with the estimates from these assessments. When these go to the SSC, when they go through the STAR panel review process, we have a part of our process that takes into account scientific uncertainty and then combines with the risk management preferences of the council to create buffers around the estimates of the OFLs. And that process is really designed to take into account the uncertainty that we have with these assessments. So that's sort of one piece of this. The other piece of it is why our assessments change from one to the next. And again, I think what we can do is do a lot of bridging analyses, which you see in the assessment documents. We spend a lot of time talking about that at the review meetings and with the reviewers. How has the data changed? How has the model changed from the last assessment? Building a stepwise story to understand that. And then our job here is to communicate that to you all, to say, what are we seeing now that we didn't see before and why? But then, it's a problem for the larger group, for the everyone participating in the council process to figure out together, what do we do with that uncertainty and how do we manage that risk? And so I think that's maybe not a very fully satisfying answer to the question, but I think it's a problem that we have to continue to wrestle with together. So that's my start at an answer, and I'm happy to return to it when we get to open discussion.
Do we have any other questions online? I don't see any raised hands. Oh, another hand went up. Jim Hasty. Let's go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to add on Yellow Eye to the answer to that last question. I think the point Kiva raised about the steepness had a huge impact on the evolution of the rebuilding timeframes. But Yellow Eye had some very specific challenges associated with the fact that the assessment that declared Yellow Eye to be overfished, the main index of abundance was a recreational catch per unit effort index. And that index died as soon as we shut off retention in the recreational fishery. Additionally, that also took away our biological sampling. And combined with that, our bottom trawl survey does not sample yellow eye rockfish very well because we don't get into the rocks. And so I think all of those factors kind of conspired to initially support a very long rebuilding time that has changed as a result of getting more data and beginning to think that rockfish are more productive than we did in the 2000s. Thanks.
I'm glad this is how you're enjoying your retirement, Dr. Hasty.
Thanks, Jim. Any other remote participants? Would you like to ask a question, comments? I'm not seeing any, so thank you.
All right. We have our last assessment, also an update assessment. It's Widow Rockfish, and joining me here at the table is Owen Hamel.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Owen Hamel, and I'll be presenting information on the Widow Rockfish assessment. Like Yellow Eye, this was conducted in the stock assessment course at the University of Washington with the participation of students, postdocs, agency folks from the states, and stock assessors from both the Northwest Fishery Science Center and the Alaska Fishery Science Center. So this was actually led by uh, by by students at the University of Washington, and my participation as one of the instructors was focused more on advice and review of both the methods and the reporting of the stock assessment. This is also unusual in that this is not necessarily the final word on this stock assessment. The Groundfish Subcommittee and the SSC have recommended this for further review in October at a supplemental review, and then this will be the final review of this by the SSC will take place at the November council meeting. So this review in mid-October would be by the Scientific and Statistical Committee Groundfish Subcommittee, along with an outside expert reviewer. So this additional review was requested due to the large change in the perception of the current stock size from this update compared to the previous update in 2019, and in an attempt to better understand what is driving that change. So this supplemental review would focus on exploring if there are ways to model the available data better in order to produce better fits and to better explain the data. Okay, next slide. So the last full assessment was in 2015, and there was an update in 2019. One important thing to note about widow is that they are actually of medium longevity for rockfish. We've heard about rockfish that have ages available up to over 200, and many that are above 100. These live to only somewhere in the 50s, we think. So that's low or medium or medium low longevity for a rockfish. Another important thing to note is the time series of catches here. As with yellowtail, there was a drop in catches and then an increase. Here in 2017, a large increase following the stock being declared rebuilt, I believe, in 2012 based on a 2011 stock assessment. Next slide. So some of the key assessment outputs are that the current age 4 biomass in 2025 is at about 83 or 84,000 metric tons, and the current stock status is at about 55%. So that's the fraction of unfished spawning output. So the stock looks like the stock peaked in the late teens and has been coming down due to the recent high catch levels that are somewhat similar to the catch levels in the 80s and the 90s. Next slide. So if you do look at the previous trajectories from the 2015 assessment and the 2019 update, you can see that through 2015, the overall trajectories and scales of the estimated stock, it's pretty similar, but there are some differences following that. The 2019 update predicted a large increase in the population due to estimates of some high incoming recruitments, allowing for the continued large removals. This update indicates that those large recruitments were not as large as estimated in that 2019 update, and therefore, while we don't have the forecast from that 2019 to now, which would also show a decline, you have a greater decline in the 2025 update. Next slide. Actually, can we go back to the last one? Just want to make one more point. you can see that we have this, what we would call a two-way trip going down and coming back up. That tends to make assessments more stable, unlike with rough-eye black spotted where there's a lot of uncertainty. And that's one of the reasons it's not surprising we see this sort of same scale historically across the three assessments. Okay, next slide. So why are we seeing catch limits from this assessment update be substantially lower than the previous assessments or the previous estimates from the 2019 update? So there's three important factors. And one of the most important is that the data from the past 6 years do not support the very high estimate of the 2013 year class found in the 2019 update. So if you look at the estimates of recruitment from the 2015 benchmark, the 2019 update, and the current update, you can see that they vary a little bit, but there's that very large 2013 estimate of recruitment from the 2019 update, which is not seen in 2015 because there wasn't really data to say much about that then, or seen in the current update. This is in fact the highest in the time series from 2019, but it's not all that surprising to sometimes see these very large recruitments. Back in the chili pepper assessment that we saw earlier, we had that very high 1999 recruitment, which was very important. And 1999 happened to be a year where there were lots of large recruitments. 2013, we did see large recruitments in some other fish, such as Pacific Ocean perch. So while it's a very large recruitment, it's not the sort of thing we don't see sometimes. But this, in 2019, this estimate of large recruitment was driven largely by some very limited hook and line discard length data, so a small amount of data from a small fishery, and the more recent data do not support there being a large 2013 year class, anything like that size. Next slide. Another factor is that the bottom trawl survey has observed more old fish from 2019 to 2024 than ever seen before. So this provides new information about the longevity of the species. And we talked about this earlier here as well. It can be hard to completely disentangle fishing mortality and natural mortality. But having a two-way trip in a period where you're not fishing can help with that. And we have that now in Widow. And this new data leads to lower estimates of natural mortality and therefore lower overall productivity. So these two factors, combined with the large catches since 2017, leads to a picture of lower overall productivity and lower stock status or lower stock size, which translates to lower projected catch limits. Next slide. So what does this mean? So if we continue to have catches around 10,000 metric tons this year and next year, the catch limits in the next biennium would be expected to be around 4,200 to 4,400 metric tons, and then increase over the next few years somewhat. Okay. So our current view of recent catches suggests that the fishing intensity exceeds what we would target given the new information. Next slide, please. There remains substantial uncertainty in terms of both the size and status and in projections, but I'll point to a currently declining stock This is not surprising given that the management system aims for a declining stock when the stock is substantially above the target. And this stock was substantially above the target and was estimated to be substantially above the target from the 2019 update. Next slide. So that's what I have. Here are the key takeaways, and I'm happy to take questions. So.
Thanks. I have 3 questions. The first was when you were introducing this, you said it was a student-led assessment, but in the Groundfish Subcommittee, you said you co-led it. So could you confirm that?
Sure. So while the students are the ones sort of doing more of the technical work, the instructors are reviewing everything that's being done, ensuring everything is being done correctly, giving advice on how to do things. So the students are the lead authors of the assessment, but we're all involved in the development and ensuring that it is done correctly.
And then based on what you were just saying, was there a mistake made then in the 2019 update regarding the 2013 strength of that class?
So in the 2015 assessment that went through the STAR panel, the assessment was, all of the aspects of the assessment were reviewed, including the structure of the assessment, which included how the fleets were structured, how the discard was estimated. There was, in that assessment, in developing the discard length comps from the hook and line fleet, there was an error in including some data from another fleet in those length compositions that continued in 2019. However, in 2015, that had little impact on the outcome of the assessment when it was fully reviewed. In 2019, it was those data in its entirety that was the principal driver of the estimate of that high 2013 year class.
So yes, right? Is that, yeah.
Well, I want to be clear that it's that approach was in the 2015 full assessment,
Okay.
and it was carried over into the 2019 update, as we do typically do the same things for updates.
Okay, thanks. We were always taught that we called them big old fat females. They were the most fecund, right? And so I'm trying to understand how now that, I think what I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, you say is now that we believe widow, new information shows that widow lives longer, that how does that equal lower productivity?
So
I don't
that's a good
understand
question. Yeah. So so it's not. Yeah. So we estimate recruitment, right? And there's some relationship between actually eggs produced and the successful recruitment of young fish into the fishery, right? And we calculate that relationship, and that relationship, we have 2 bits of data: how many eggs are being produced, and what recruitment we're seeing coming into the fishery or estimating coming into the fishery. And those things have some relationship, and in every assessment, that relationship, changes based on our estimate of how many eggs are being produced, and our estimate of how much recruitment is coming in across the time series. So the fact that maybe we're seeing more eggs being produced, but we're not seeing a change in the recruitment, and so just because there's more eggs on average being produced, that just tells us, well, maybe not as many are surviving, because we're estimating the same recruitment that we saw before on average. So what this is telling us in this case they're living longer means that given the biomass that we're seeing out there, less of it is coming from each year. And so therefore, we can't take as much each year because less new biomass is coming in every year. Because they live longer, the biomass we see each year comes from fish that are living over a long period of time. And so it's not as if something that turns over really quickly has a very high natural mortality rate. The fish we see in 1 year might be mostly fish that are new and that weren't around the previous year. When they live a really long time, that fish is going to be there over a huge range of years, and therefore we can't take as much each year.
Great. And then my final question, and I asked this of Kristen on Yellowtail the other day, but for this particular assessment, from the industry perspective, from people on the water, it is so markedly different than what they experience in reality. How do you explain that? Because there's very little confidence in the results of this assessment.
I would say, first that with the expected supplemental review, there's more work being done to look at sort of spatial aspects and things like that that may help with that. And I think that's something that we can discuss further there. And I don't have all of that information yet because that's being worked on. And I think that would be a really good place to talk about that.
I do have one more quick one, and then I'll step down. And that is, but you brought this forward thinking it was the best available science, correct? You didn't produce this assessment, or your students didn't produce this assessment, and you came to the SSE saying, we think it should go to mop-up. You brought it forward thinking it was the best available science. Is that accurate or no?
Well, yes. So, but by best available, right? I mean, doesn't mean, I don't think with any of our assessments, we think there aren't, if we had the time and resources, we couldn't do more, right? I mean, none of them are perfect. So this was an update assessment, which of course limits what we could do. Had we been doing a benchmark assessment, we would have put more resources into it and we would have done more. So in terms of, given that it was a benchmark assessment, we had a lot more data. Given the new information we had, that definitely showed things that were different than were estimated before based on new data. Yes, I consider this the best available science at the moment.
Thanks, I appreciate that. I know you're going to get to the general stuff, and I'll just echo Tom's comments. When we're in the industry hearing there's not enough time to get something done, and these kinds of things come out, excuse me, I got a frog in my throat, it impacts our paychecks, right? It impacts people's businesses. It does have real world implications. And Kristen, you said, we need to get through this together, but you guys aren't losing your paychecks. You're not losing your businesses. And so that's why making sure there is confidence from stakeholders in what's being produced is just so very important. So I just wanted to make that point, and I appreciate your candor. Thanks.
Just before we move on, if I can just add a little bit to Owen's responses there, just because, Heather, on your, I think it was your point 3 about the big old fat females, to mention that the looking at the fecundity relationship for widow is also something that is going to be examined as part of the supplemental review work as well. So stay tuned for that. And on the just the overall question about these updates and the role that this class at UW plays in them, I just want to emphasize that this is a course at the University of Washington that has been going on for a number of years and has produced, well, how many assessments? I want you to know off the top of your head. I can't remember, but probably 10, 12 different assessments.
Yeah, probably 12 at least.
Over the past 12 years. And And it's a really important part of training both our new hires when we hire folks at the Northwest Fishery Science Center, as well as training people that are before they become stock assessment scientists, and has led to a number of positions across the agency. So it's always, all of these assessments are conducted alongside senior stock assessment scientists, and as Owen articulated, you know, the work is carefully reviewed and guided by those folks. And then I guess I would also just mention, because the supplemental review came up, at this point for the widow update, the work is being led by Kiva and Ian Taylor and Vlada Gritseva, the three stock assessment scientists on our staff. So that's who you'll hear from in the supplemental review and the analyses that are ongoing. And I think I'm going to leave it there, but to come back to your the hardest question, let's do that after we're done with the widow specific questions.
Are there any other widow specific questions in the room? If not, I'm going to go to the remote participants as well. Could everyone raise hand if you'd like to make remote public comment or have a question? Let's go ahead with Jeff Lackey, please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Jeff Lackey. I'm the midwater trawl rep on the Gap. I manage 2 trawl vessels out of Newport. I am not a fisherman, but that means I have time to go to council and dig into lots of documents and dig into stock assessments. And I talked to a bunch of fishermen compiling information on different species, including widow. Within our trawl fleet, we have a lot of older fishermen, many that are now owners who fished up and down the coast for widow for decades, and are involved in the fishery now, so they know what's going on. And so we have, we know that widow are, pretty prevalent in Central California, all the way up the coast. And not only do we have that from the bottom trawl survey, but the fishermen who have the knowledge back when you could fish on a lot of the grounds, you could fish on rocks, you could fish on the shelf. They can tell you now where all the prime widow spots are on the shelf, on rocks on the shelf, that don't really get reflected in fishing data or in bottom trawl survey very much. Although in the bottom trawl survey, you may see more catch of widow when you get closer to those areas that have a lot of widow. And so we also know the vessel that I manage, talking to the captain this year, this is one of the most productive years for fishing. I looked at some of his tracks online for the spring. I don't know if there's like 15 or 20 tracks, and they all go out to the same place from Newport out, straight out, fishing over a couple seamounts and straight back. And it's been the most productive place on the coast, and it's where fishermen go because it's closer to the ports where they process, and because you're not worried about catching other species as nearly as much in a lot of other places that they know there's widow, but they don't go, either because it's far away, or you're going to catch smalls, or you're going to catch things you don't want to catch, or it's just not as productive. And so we know that the fishing has taken place on a smaller subset, particularly in the really prime fishing grounds, and it's held up for 8 years, average over 10,000 metric tons a year. And the CPUE in the most prime spot and the good spots hadn't slowed down. So when the fishermen see that there is a projected by the end of this biennium, like a 46 or 47% drop in biomass of the whole coast within that time projected, when our prime spots are as prime as ever, and they know we're not going up and down the coast nearly as much as we could, and there's a lot of spots, just about all of California, then tons of spots on the shelf that we're not even touching. And so the fishermen pretty much know that there's an issue there, that just doesn't look like it could be true. But I was very glad to hear about looking at more spatial modeling, and I would love to hear more about that coming up at the supplemental. because if we overlay the functional and spatial nature of the fishery with the stock itself, are there model tools that can deal with such a fishery where the fishing is taking place at concentrated areas that are a very small subset of the spatial stock?
Sure. So I'm going to let Kiva address that question.
Hi, Jeff. So I've been looking at from the observer data, the same data that I was using with yellowtail. I've also been looking at the widow catches, and I totally see there's two hot spots where everyone's fishing off of Central Oregon and off of the Columbia River. So I think the question is, what do we do with that information? And one thing we can do is we can, there's definitely a trend where the average age in the fishery is declining. And the average age in the survey is increasing. And you're right, the survey sees a lot of widow down in California where nobody is fishing. I can see that in the data. And so we have thought a little bit about how to deal with that. So one thing we can do is we can say, well, the fishery is sort of locally fishing down the stock, and the age structure is going to get depleted locally, but maybe not across the whole population. And so there are ways we can handle that in the selectivity, which I think we might discuss a bit at the supplemental review. It is a really hard question to ask, though. Our stock assessment models are not spatially explicit, because it's really hard to make a spatially explicit model when we don't know the locations where each age is sampled from. So if we don't know the exact location where an age came from, which we're never going to get because the ages aren't collected until you're back to shore, it's hard to build a fully spatially explicit model. Yeah, so those are some thoughts. But
I would say also there's a question of movement as well, and without understanding, for something where you have really localized hotspots, there's really small scale movement can have an impact, right? So we're not just talking sort of movement between states, but smaller scale movement, and that's really hard to understand and then to model.
Thank you. I'll look forward to the supplemental. There are some challenges.
Yeah, thanks. I'm looking around the room and also looking at the remote participants. Anyone else have a raised hand that would like to ask a question about widow in particular? And then I think we'll go to a slightly more open discussion format until we're able to close. We are at 3:42 at this point, so just keep that in mind. Thank you for everyone for all your questions. I don't see any further hands. Go ahead, Kristen, thanks.
Okay, so yeah, I think we can open it up for more general questions or discussion if folks want to circle back to any of the assessments that we covered earlier, or talk about some of these cross-assessment issues that have come up. Let's open it up for that. There's Andre. Yeah.
I've always got a comment. So firstly, we need to see these assessments in a broader context than perhaps this council is aware of. So in my real job, I work in fisheries assessments in multiple regions of the US and multiple continents, which means I get to go all over the world, like Jason. And I think there are a couple of lessons that we learn from that, perhaps we don't really see within the context of the assessments we're getting here. And some of these came up as we listened to today. The first one is, and I think both Kristen, Kristen, not Kirsten, I get my Kristens and Kirstens mixed up these days, and Owen highlighted is the fact is we know that these assessments change from one assessment cycle to the next. And in fact, Steve Ralston back in 2010, our P-STAR, the design of P-STAR was to reflect this fact that no matter how good the assessments are and how good our data are, by their necessity and the nature of the statistical estimations we use, these assessments will change from one year to the next. And that is the background, as I say, for the sigmas that we use, but it's also a reflection of the fact that as we move through time, we try to introduce new data, new methods. So it's unfortunate these things change, but it is part of the scientific process that we should almost expect. And I'm going to bring in a saying that I have to do in all meetings, which is forestry is like fisheries, except the trees move and they're invisible. And what do I mean by that? When we look at assessments, not just at this council, but in other regions around the world, it is not unreasonable, given the statistical methods we use, to see changes in these assessments of the kind of scale that we've seen here, sort of as from 20 to 40% from one assessment to the next, just given the nature of the data that we use in the statistical method. So I think we need to perhaps remind people or make it much more sort of transparent that this sort of change is part of the process, is part of statistics. We're not doing forestry work here. These are statistical methods. A second point that came up, which I think increasingly we're seeing, is that for good reasons and for luck in our part, we've rebuilt stocks far faster than we anticipated back in the 2000s. So Brad, you and I were there, 2073, or I think it was 21. I think we had yellow eye over the 22nd century at one stage. What we've seen, what we see in different regions around the world is sort of consistent optimism or pessimism. So we've been lucky in the sense that we seem to have got the coin flipping heads here on the West Coast. I also work on crab in the North Pacific. The coin has been exactly the opposite up there. We've had rebuilding strategies that have taken longer than we anticipated, admittedly not 2200. In Southern Australia, we've got several stocks that have been under rebuilding for decades, and we're seeing absolutely no increase. And we're seeing it across multiple species. So there are environmental effects that are affecting multiple species simultaneously. So we on the West Coast, I'll take if we're on the West Coast, I'll take the good outcomes than some of the things we've seen in other regions. What else was I going to say? The other thing, we're sending this assessment to supplementary review, the widow assessment. And I think we need to look at that in the context of two things. One, this is a council that has this process. Not every council around the US has the idea that you can send assessments. We have a process to try to resolve these issues. In other regions, it's either we adopt or we move on. And certainly in other countries, without the kind of resources that the US has, that's simply not available. So I think we need to expect some assessments to go to supplementary, and we have got a process to try to deal with them. My slightly negative, my concern, I'm really excited to see the project that's going to try to use fishery-dependent CPUE data. I have to say that these are good people. I would not bet your house that this is going to work. We've been trying to do this sort of thing for literally decades. The purpose of being a fisherman is to catch fish. The purpose of a survey is to survey. And what we're really trying to do in these models is turn fishery data into survey data. And it is a really hard problem because fishers are designed or aiming to fish the areas where they fish. We want them to fish randomly. That's not what you want to do, but it's what the analysis is trying to do. It's trying to take data that were collected for a very specific purpose to catch fish and turning it into the data that would have been collected if fishers operated like a survey vessel. So I'm looking forward to that result, but I think we shouldn't put too much emphasis on this is going to solve the problem, because a lot of smart people have looked at this for a very long time, and everything that we've seen to date is we don't get an answer that passes muster scientifically. So just a warning there. I guess the final one is just the students. Obviously, I'm a professor at the University of Washington. These are my students. I'm the sort of next level up from Owen in the sense of this my program that's this is involved in. Those students put an enormous amount of work into this. One has to remember this is an update. So the very fact that we've got this assessment and the amount of work that we've got to the point of actually sending it to supplementary needs to be recognized. Most of these students didn't make much progress on their theses, of which I am somewhat disappointed. But you know, a lot of work went into this. The very fact that we're able to see and have this discussion reflects the work that was done here. And I, in particular, want to thank the NOAA people for all the investment they put into mentoring these students, because I certainly wouldn't have the amount of time that they have been able to put in here. So I think we need to also remember that we have a capacity problem in this country and, in fact, around the world. And so developing that capacity will strengthen us going forward.
Thanks, Andre. Is there anything you want to respond to there? No, appreciate that perspective. Heather, you want to come back up?
I am. My husband had spinal fusion at OHSU, which is a teaching hospital. A student did the surgery with a doctor next to him, and it failed. My point is, you can have mistakes. That's my point. Obviously, people need to be trained, but it's not meant to be a criticism of the students. It's meant to say everybody's human, and we need to make sure that we're really crossing all those T's and dotting all those I's, right? And so I'm interested in also understanding how in these classes are we teaching, how are you teaching them in terms of how do you value fishery-dependent data or information provided directly by fishermen? Like, I understand it doesn't fit neatly into an indice or something like that, but maybe we need to start doing things differently. And as leaders on the West Coast and in the North Pacific, where my boats participate in both areas, we have a lot of really smart people. Maybe we need to be doing things differently instead of being stuck in an old paradigm. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I do know right now there are many, many fishermen that are willing to participate in that process. And if we can't figure out how to do that, I'm just concerned that this confidence will continue to erode. At the same time, the industry is fighting for dollars right now for science, for NOAA, for the council process. So it just, there has to be a better way to do this. I don't know what it is exactly, but I know you have people that are willing and want to do it. So, you know, maybe we can, Andre, lead the world in a new way to do things like that, especially with limited and eroding resources. You have thousands of years of experience on the water that you can tap into. So I think I'd be interested in understanding how that's taught, how fishery-dependent information is valued in those classes versus the textbooks of Sigma and everything else.
Do you have anything you want to say? Thanks for that, Heather. I guess I would say I'll let Owen speak specifically to the class as it is currently. I think one thing that has come up around discussions around these update assessments is, at least right now, our process doesn't have the same pre-assessment data workshop process as we do for benchmarks, right? And so I think that seems like an area for more discussion. Like, would that benefit some of these updates and be a useful venue for everyone to be able to share information before we go down the road of conducting them or as part of that process. So I think I'm thinking, just thinking ahead, the SSE and the Groundfish Subcommittee has a wait, what do we call it now? I'm going to use the wrong name. Cheryl, help me. Our end of the cycle process review meeting that happens in January, and I think that is one opportunity to think about what changes we should be thinking about for the next cycle. I think we're going to hear back from the council on their assessment process review project early in the next calendar year, I think. And I think we'll get more input there, and I hope that we can sort of continue these conversations around opportunities. I think opportunities for cooperative research remain to be an area where we're likely to see support, and so that those are things that many of us are interested in continuing to pursue. So I appreciate the comments and the suggestions, and look forward to seeing how we can move forward together.
Yeah, and I think the pre-assessment workshops as well is something that we typically haven't done them for updates because we see that more useful when we're developing the full benchmark assessments, making more decisions about what data to use and how to use that data. But I think it could be useful, particularly for the students, to have that interaction. And of course, if the assessment hasn't been done for several years, there can be changes to that data that we might not fully be aware of, or where discussion might help. So I think in our class too, certainly we work with fishery-dependent data, but we don't typically have members of industry coming in and talking to us about the species we're working on. That's something we could consider adding to the class. I don't know.
Thanks. I also wanted to go to a remote hand that was raised. Jeff Lackey, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks. I believe that commercial fishery data can be very informative, but it absolutely has to have the spatial and functional context included. For example, talking about the places where Widow just keeps on being productive. If it stops being productive there and you see boats, there's less CPUE and boats start going down the edge further south more. They start going on the shelf. You might have fishermen coming to you saying, hey, you may want to do an update. Something's off. Same thing with petrale. You talk to fishermen from decades ago that were going everywhere just to scratch on the shelf, to scratch for petrale, whereas now you got to be careful not to have a long tow because it's just catching so fast at the spawning grounds. They're just going gangbusters, like just unbelievable. And so, but you have to understand the real world markers and the spatial and functional nature of the fishery, and talk to the fishermen. What gear are they changing? What are they doing different? Why did they move? What's going on? It has to have context too, but the commercial fishery data can be very informative.
Yeah, and that's the thing I was going to say at the end that I forgot, that yes, I think having more discussions about what data or information is available from the fishery and how we could possibly use it, or what additional information could be collected, is something that would be useful.
So I think we're going to move to wrapping this up. And I just want to close by thanking you all again for taking the time to be here and all the really great questions and discussion that we've had. And echo just the comments that I had at the beginning that, we're really interested in feedback on how this is working. So did you like this session? Do you like these at-a-glance summaries? How do you feel about the risk tables? Come talk to us and let us know, and we'll continue to iterate with you to figure out how we can communicate the science that we're doing. So thanks a lot.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone online. Again, we have recorded this session and we will be posting that for folks that may have missed it, as well as looking forward to the council discussion on agenda item G3, which will happen on Monday. Again, thanks, everyone, for coming and participating.